In 1846, Georgia, two black twin boys were buried in the same grave, but whispers claimed one of them was still alive when the soil covered him. This is the story of the Harroway Twins, children born into slavery, studied by doctors, erased from records, and remembered only through fragments of folklore and fear. If you're drawn to these forgotten histories, subscribe to the Macabre Record and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. In 1872, long after the Civil War had ended and the plantations of Georgia had begun to rot back into the soil, a parish gravedigger uncovered something unusual. Behind the ruin of a small church near the Harroway estate, hidden beneath weeds and creeping vines, he found two child-sized coffins stacked one atop the other. They were waterlogged and rotting, but inside lay bones that were too small for any grown man or woman, yet far too carefully buried to have been discarded like refuse. Stranger still, the burial record for that summer listed no children at all. Only when the gravedigger turned to the parish register did he see the faint outline of two names that had once been written in ink and later scratched away with such force that the paper itself had torn. He could still make out enough to read Isaiah Harroway, Jacob Harroway. No other record of those children exists, not in the census, not in the slave schedules, not in the plantation's surviving ledgers. Their mother's name is gone, their father's is unknown, and their parish line was blotted out as if they had never drawn breath. Yet whispers endured. Old freedmen spoke of two black twins, born in 1846, who were unlike any others the county had ever seen. One, they said, was strong and ordinary. The other was pale-eyed, weak and strange, a child whose presence unsettled even hardened overseers. What bound them was not just blood, but something deeper, something doctors could not explain and neighbors did not dare to name. The most chilling rumor is the one that has never been confirmed and never been disproven, that in the summer of 1852, when the boys were lowered into the same grave, one of them was still alive. Buried not because he had died, but because he was tied to his brother by a bond neither church nor science could sever. Some said it was superstition, some said it was cruelty, but others insisted it was deliberate, an attempt to silence a mystery that frightened them all. What remains today are only fragments, a torn register, a scattered letter, a few lines in a forgotten medical journal, and the folklore of the county that still speaks in hushed tones of the Harroway Twins. And it is from these fragments that we must now reconstruct a story that was never meant to be told. The year was 1846, a season of heavy heat and swarming insects in the fields of Georgia when the twins first came into the world. Their mother was an enslaved woman known only in fragments of testimony as Lydia. She labored not in the safety of a home, but in a crude cabin watched over by the plantation midwife, and, as was common, by white overseers who sought to record every birth like inventory. The moment the cries split the air, the midwife crossed herself and whispered that the children had been born beneath a blood-red moon, a sign many believed carried ill fortune. The first boy, Isaiah, was healthy, with strong lungs and a cry that echoed through the cabin. The second, Jacob, emerged smaller, struggling for breath, his skin sallow, his eyes pale in a way that unsettled all who looked upon him. The midwife urged silence, fearing that word of his appearance would spread too quickly. For in that time and place, the birth of twins was not regarded as a blessing, but as an omen. Among the enslaved community, stories carried from Africa told of twin spirits, sometimes divine, sometimes cursed, beings who were bound together for reasons beyond human understanding. Among the white overseers, twins were often viewed as unnatural, a sign of weakness or deformity that demanded the scrutiny of physicians eager to prove their theories about race and biology. It did not take long for whispers to drift beyond the cabin walls. Other women spoke in hushed tones about how Jacob's eyes seemed to stare past them, unblinking, as though he saw something no one else could see. Some said the boy was a spirit born into flesh, too frail to stay long. Others claimed that he drew his strength from his brother, that every breath Isaiah took was one Jacob had stolen. In a society where superstition and cruelty often went hand in hand, such whispers carried danger. Yet for a time, the children were allowed to remain with their mother, hidden from the fields and the gaze of outsiders. Lydia wrapped them tightly and sang to them at night, praying over their frail lives. But already the fate of the twins was no longer her own to decide. Rumours have a way of travelling quickly, and in the 1840s, Georgia, rumours about black bodies, especially those considered unusual, drew the attention of men who saw not children but specimens, men who would soon come calling. To understand what the Harroway twins were born into, one must first understand the world of Georgia in the 1840s. It was a land where cotton ruled, where the wealth of planters was measured in the bodies they owned, and where the church bells rang not for the enslaved, but for the men who claimed dominion over them. In those years, superstition and science often walked hand in hand, both serving the same cruel master. The Bible was invoked to justify bondage, while physicians used enslaved people as living experiments to advance their theories about race. In the quarters, the enslaved carried with them fragments of African tradition, stories of spirits and ancestors, warnings about twins who shared one soul in two bodies. In the plantation houses, the white families regarded such beliefs as foolish, yet their own fears were scarcely less superstitious. Among them, twins were often considered a dangerous anomaly, a disruption of nature's order. Ministers whispered that such births hinted at sin or divine punishment, while physicians, drunk on the growing authority of medicine, sought to classify them as biological errors. The strange and the unusual were not protected in this world. They were examined, displayed, and, more often than not, erased. At the same time, American medicine was hungry for proof of its own authority. This was the age when doctors dissected bodies without consent, when medical schools sought cadavers at any cost, and when physicians in the South grew notorious for experimenting upon the enslaved. Every peculiarity of the black body was catalogued, exaggerated, or exploited. To men such as these, twins like Isaiah and Jacob were not simply children. They were opportunities, living puzzles whose very existence could be dissected in search of answers that might win a reputation in the growing field of anatomy. The Harroway plantation, with its reputation for cruelty, was precisely the kind of place where such opportunities would be allowed to flourish. Already, whispers of the twins had reached beyond the cabins, carried on hushed voices from the fields to the town. By the time the boys had seen their third summer, rumours had spread far enough to draw the curiosity of men who wrote their findings in journals rather than scriptures. They would come not as neighbours, not as friends, but as men of learning, cloaked in the cold authority of science. And once their gaze fell upon the Harroway twins, there would be no turning back. The Harroway plantation lay a few miles outside Augusta, a sprawl of fields and cabins pressed against the riverbank, its soil dark and heavy with cotton. The name Harroway still carries an uneasy weight in the county's oldest records, for the family's reputation was not merely one of wealth, but of cruelty. The master of the estate, Thomas Harroway, was a man who valued bodies only for what they could yield, whether in crops, coin, or curiosity. He was known to lend his enslaved to neighbours, to traders, and, more ominously, to physicians who wished to examine what they called peculiar cases. The cabins of the enslaved were clustered at the edge of the fields, their interiors cramped, air thick with smoke and the smell of sweat and soil. Lydia, the twins' mother, was given no reprieve after her delivery. She returned to the fields within weeks, the babies strapped to her back as she bent over the cotton. She left them in the care of the other women when she could, but Jacob, frail and sickly, often kept her close. Isaiah thrived where his brother withered, yet both seemed to exist in a rhythm too tightly bound to be natural. When Isaiah fell, Jacob wept. When Jacob coughed blood, Isaiah paled as if drained of breath. The overseer, a hard man by the name of McClellan, refused to go near Jacob once the boy grew past infancy. He told Harroway, in words half-muttered, that the child had a gaze that unsettled even him. "It don't look like a child's eyes," he was reported to have said. "It looks like something older, like he's waiting on you to speak." Harroway dismissed the talk as foolishness, but he did not ignore the whispers that spread among the cabins. He knew too well the value that rumors of strangeness could hold for men who collected anomalies as trophies. What mattered to Harroway was not whether the children were cursed, or blessed, or burdened with strange spirits. What mattered was that their very existence could be bartered. In the antebellum South, the unusual was not hidden for protection, it was paraded for profit. And so Harroway began to keep notes of his own, small marks in ledgers beside the names of Isaiah and Jacob, marks that set them apart from the other children of the plantation. He would not sell them, not yet. He would wait for the right man to come calling, one who knew the value of what the Harroways had brought into the world. By the time Isaiah and Jacob reached their 5th year, the differences between them were unmistakable. Isaiah grew tall and strong, his shoulders broadening with the promise of labor that the fields would soon demand. His laughter carried across the cabins, and when he ran, his feet beat a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Jacob, by contrast, seemed to wither even as his brother flourished. His skin remained pale, his frame delicate, and his voice seldom more than a whisper. Yet when one looked closely, it was not simply frailty that set Jacob apart, but the uncanny way the brothers mirrored one another in pain. Neighbors told stories of Isaiah stumbling suddenly in the fields, clutching his chest, only for word to come minutes later that Jacob had fallen ill in the cabin. Lydia, their mother, spoke of nights when Jacob burned with fever, eyes rolling back in his head, while Isaiah cried out in his sleep, drenched in sweat as though suffering the same affliction. When Jacob's thin arm was scraped against the cabin door, a bruise bloomed on Isaiah's skin in nearly the same place. The other children of the plantation learned quickly not to play rough with Isaiah, for any harm done to him brought Jacob to the brink of collapse. These occurrences bred unease among the enslaved community. Some whispered that the twins were bound by a single spirit, 2 vessels carrying one life between them. Older voices, recalling stories from Africa, spoke of sacred twins, twins who could bring blessings if honored or curses if neglected. The elders urged caution, but the overseer grew more disturbed with each passing year. McClellan was said to have refused to strike Isaiah after 1 whipping left, Jacob gasping, his lips turning blue though he had not been touched. "It ain't natural," he muttered, crossing himself, "and I want no part of it." The bond between the boys drew them ever closer. Isaiah became Jacob's protector, carrying him on his back when his legs gave out, defending him from the jeers of other children. Jacob seldom spoke, but when he did, it was to Isaiah alone, words so soft that others could not hear. Some swore that Isaiah seemed to answer even when Jacob's lips never moved, as though their thoughts passed silently between them. It was in these early years that the Harroway twins ceased to be merely children in the eyes of those around them. To their mother, they were sons. To their community, they were an omen. And to Thomas Harroway, watching from the distance with ledger in hand, they were becoming a rarity worth more alive than dead. By the late 1840s, the strange case of the Harroway twins was no longer confined to the cabins and fields of the plantation. Word carried, as it always did, from one farm to the next, until whispers of the boys reached the ears of those in neighboring towns. In the South, stories had a way of growing larger with each retelling, and soon the tale of Isaiah and Jacob Harroway was told not as fact, but as legend. One account spoke of a boy so strong he could haul cotton twice his size, bound to a brother so weak he could scarcely rise from bed. Another described a child with eyes the color of milk who watched his brother bleed when no blade had touched him. The details shifted, but the unease remained constant. Among the enslaved communities, the twins were interpreted through older traditions. Some drew on the Yoruba belief that twins carried divine significance, that one embodied protection while the other embodied vulnerability. Others murmured of spirits that split in 2, condemned to wander in flesh until reunited in death. The women in the cabins cautioned their children not to stare at Jacob too long, fearing his gaze might draw them into his suffering. Yet in the same breath, some mothers whispered prayers in his direction, believing he carried a kind of power beyond this world. The white families who heard of the Harroway boys reacted differently. They leaned into suspicion, muttering that such births were signs of weakness or worse, corruption of blood. Ministers warned from pulpits that such children were reminders of mankind's fallen nature, and more than one sermon twisted scripture to explain that God had not intended such duplications of life. But it was not the church that would come knocking first. It was the men who claimed science as their gospel, physicians eager to probe what others feared to even name. By 1849, rumors of the twins had reached the ears of men who recorded anomalies in journals and sketched them in anatomical detail. The Harroway boys, it was said, were unlike any others in Georgia, and while the whispers of neighbors cast them as omens, to the medical men of the South they were something else entirely, living experiments waiting to be claimed. The stage was set. Folklore had made the twins into figures of fear and fascination. But soon a new gaze would fall upon them, colder than superstition and far more dangerous than rumor. It was in the spring of 1850 when a stranger arrived at the Harroway estate, a man whose presence unsettled even those accustomed to the harshness of the plantation. His name was Dr. Silas Greaves, a traveling physician with a reputation for curiosity that strayed far beyond the boundaries of decency. Greaves had studied in Charleston, corresponded with surgeons in New Orleans, and was known to carry a leather satchel filled not only with instruments but with journals crowded with sketches of bones and malformed births. His visits were seldom welcome, for where he lingered, silence followed. Yet to Thomas Harroway, Greaves represented opportunity. Greaves had heard of the twins through rumor and second-hand accounts, and from the moment he set eyes upon Isaiah and Jacob, his fascination deepened into obsession. He described them not as children, but as a living demonstration of duplicity in nature, and in his notes, which would later surface in fragments, he wrote with the detachment of a man who saw not two boys, but a riddle to be solved. "They appear," he scrawled, "to share a concordance of vitality. Injuries sustained by one are mirrored in the other, though in varying degree. This suggests not coincidence, but a tethering of the vital spirit." His arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter in the twins' lives, one darker than even the overseer's whip. He observed Jacob's frailty with a hunger in his eyes, studying the boy's pale gaze as though it were a window into some hidden mechanism of flesh. He tested their pulses, compared their breathing, and recorded the ways their bodies seemed to echo one another. When Isaiah stumbled in pain as Jacob's chest was pressed, Greaves's face did not show concern, but triumph. He believed he had found living proof of what he called sympathetic physiology, a theory whispered among the few physicians reckless enough to admit they pursued it. Those who witnessed his examinations recalled the coldness with which he spoke, as though the boys were no more than objects. Jacob shivered when Greaves drew near, while Isaiah clung to his brother's hand, his jaw tight with silent defiance. The enslaved community avoided the doctor's shadow, whispering that he carried death in his bag. Yet within the Harroway house, Greaves was given space and silence to pursue his interest. Harroway saw profit, and Greaves saw glory. And for Isaiah and Jacob, it was the beginning of experiments that would stretch the thin cord, binding their lives to the breaking point. Greaves did not wait long before pushing his examinations further. What began as observations soon turned into trials that blurred the line between study and cruelty. He pricked Jacob's arm with a fine needle, watching intently as a bead of blood welled up on the frail boy's skin. Isaiah, standing only a few feet away, winced and pressed at the same spot on his own arm, though no wound marked him. Greaves scribbled furiously into his journal, his lips curling in satisfaction. "The concordance is undeniable," he wrote. "The tether is not illusion, but measurable fact." From there, the doctor's experiments deepened. He measured their pulses, their breaths, their reflexes under light and pain. Jacob, too weak to resist, endured each intrusion in silence, while Isaiah cried out whenever his brother's body was handled. The enslaved families whispered of nights when Isaiah stumbled into the cabins, holding his stomach as Jacob retched in the next room. Bruises appeared on Isaiah's body that mirrored wounds left on Jacob during Greaves' examinations. The children of the quarters began to avoid the twins altogether, muttering that to touch one was to invite the suffering of both. But Greaves was not content with mere demonstration. In one chilling entry, half charred from age but still legible, he described a tentative incision made along the subject's rib, no more than half an inch. Jacob's skin was marked, blood pooling at the cut. Isaiah screamed, collapsing in the dirt outside, though no blade had touched him. It was enough for Greaves to convince himself he stood on the brink of discovery, proof that the invisible threads of life could be mapped and perhaps severed. "They are as two bodies inhabited by a single force," he wrote. "If I can untwine them, I may understand what binds the rest of us." Lydia begged for her children to be spared, but her pleas were drowned beneath Harroway's ambition and Greaves' obsession. Each examination left the boys weaker, their bond more undeniable, and yet neither man would relent. For Harroway, they were profit. For Greaves, they were fame. For Isaiah and Jacob, they were simply survival, clinging to one another in a world determined to pull them apart. And as Greaves pressed further, the whispers around the plantation grew darker. Some said he meant to cut them open, to separate what was never meant to be divided. Others claimed he sought not healing, but proof of how much pain one soul could endure. It was not long before Harroway saw the twins not as children, nor even as curiosities, but as currency. Greaves had begun visiting the plantation regularly, his satchel heavy with instruments and his journal swelling with notes. Each time he came, Harroway lingered close enough to overhear, and though he did not understand the doctor's language of anatomy and sympathetic bonds, he understood the glint of opportunity. To him, every hour Greaves spent with the boys was proof that their value exceeded the back-breaking labor of the fields. They could not pick cotton, but they could be rented for a different harvest: knowledge. Soon an arrangement was struck. Greaves would pay Harroway a fee for each session, compensation for the time the boys were kept from labor. What began as coin in hand grew into promises of future notoriety, of Harroway's name carried into medical circles as the owner of the remarkable twins. For a man whose wealth was measured in both acres and bodies, such recognition was intoxicating. And so the bargain was sealed. Isaiah and Jacob would be given over to Greaves whenever he demanded. The enslaved community looked on in silence, powerless to intervene. Some tried to shield Lydia from the knowledge of what was happening behind closed doors, but she knew. She heard her son's cries carried through the thin cabin walls, saw their bodies weaken with each return, and felt the hopelessness of a mother who could do nothing but cradle them afterward. She prayed, but prayer could not undo the exchange that had been made. Her sons had become property twice over, once to Harroway and now to Greaves. As the arrangement continued, the doctor's presence grew bolder. He walked openly across the fields, scribbling in his notebooks, while Isaiah stumbled beside Jacob, both boys tethered by a pain that none but they could feel. Greaves began hinting at lectures he might give in Savannah or Charleston, exhibitions where men of medicine might witness firsthand what he alone had observed. To Harroway, such prospects meant prestige. To the twins, it meant there would be no end. The more Greaves studied, the weaker Jacob became. His skin turned nearly translucent, his breath shallow, and yet, when he faltered, Isaiah faltered with him, drained as though the very force of life was split between them. The overseers shook their heads and muttered that this bargain could bring nothing but ruin. But Harroway pressed on, blind to warning, deaf to whispers, convinced that the suffering of two children was nothing compared to the fortune their strangeness might yield. By the summer of 1851, the bond between Isaiah and Jacob was no longer dismissed as rumor or superstition. It was seen, felt, and feared by anyone who dared to watch them closely. When Jacob's frail body was pierced by Greaves's needle, Isaiah would cry out as if struck. When Isaiah was whipped for failing to meet a quota in the fields, Jacob's back would welt in the same place, though no lash had touched him. Their connection had become undeniable, a living rebuke to the laws of flesh and bone. The enslaved families began to speak of them only in hushed tones. Their stories passed from cabin to cabin like contraband. Some believed the boys carried one soul divided, and that to harm either was to risk angering forces beyond human control. Others feared that Jacob, in his frailty, drew his strength directly from Isaiah, consuming his brother's vitality like a shadow feeding on light. Among the children, Isaiah was avoided, not because he was cruel, but because to strike him, even in play, was to invite Jacob's suffering, and no one wished to bear witness to that eerie reflection of pain. Greaves documented these occurrences with feverish precision. He pressed Isaiah's hand into hot water until blisters rose, and Jacob screamed though untouched. He pricked Jacob's skin until blood welled up, and Isaiah staggered to the floor, clutching his arm. Each time the doctor's fascination deepened. "They are," he wrote, "as if bound by cords unseen. The body of one is a mirror, the other a reflection, neither whole without the other, and yet not conjoined in flesh. This is no ordinary twinship, but a single essence divided. But to the boys themselves, it was no marvel. It was their torment. Isaiah tried to shield Jacob, stepping between him and the doctor's instruments, bearing what pain he could, so his brother might suffer less. Jacob, though weak, would cling to Isaiah's hand, his eyes wide with a silent plea that seemed to speak louder than words. They lived not as two, but as one, caught in a cycle of suffering that neither faith nor reason could explain. The overseers, once hardened men who scoffed at fear, now refused to touch the boys. "There's no sense in whipping shadows," McClellan muttered, keeping his distance. Yet Greaves pressed harder, determined to prove the mystery, and somewhere in the silence between their cries, a dreadful plan began to take shape, one that would test whether this bond could be broken by the knife. Dr. Silas Greaves had always been a man of ambition, but after months with the Harroway Twins, that ambition hardened into mania. He no longer came merely to observe. He arrived with the urgency of a man who believed destiny itself had placed the boys in his path. His journals, fragments of which survive in scorched pages and brittle ink, reveal a descent into obsession. He wrote not of children, but of living instruments through which nature's secrets might be pried open. Letters sent to colleagues in Charleston and New Orleans describe his fixation. "I have found," he wrote, "a case of sympathetic vitality so precise that it defies all known principles. The bodies are separate, the flesh distinct, yet the force of life is as though shared, like a flame divided yet burning from the same wick." His words carried the excitement of a discovery that could secure his name in the annals of medicine. Yet, between the lines, darker hints surface, whispers of procedures too dreadful to disclose in polite correspondence. One recipient later recalled that Greaves had spoken in confidence of attempting separation, not of bodies conjoined in flesh, but of spirits bound invisibly. The more Greaves wrote, the less he seemed to care for the boys' survival. He recorded their cries with clinical detachment, describing Jacob's frailty as an acceptable loss if the experiment demanded it. He noted Isaiah's resilience as though it were proof of a soul straining against division. To Greaves, pain was not cruelty, but evidence, each scream a data point, each tear a measure of progress. And yet, the journals reveal gaps, torn pages where entries should have been, smudges of ink that suggest words hastily struck out. One fragment mentions the night of incision, when the elder collapsed though untouched. Another, more chilling, trails off after the phrase, "If death be required for proof, then so be it." Whether these were confessions or drafts abandoned out of fear, we cannot know. What is certain is that Greaves had crossed a threshold. He no longer sought understanding, he sought mastery. Even Thomas Harroway, greedy for coin and reputation, began to look uneasy at the doctor's fervour. The enslaved families, meanwhile, avoided his shadow, whispering that he carried not a physician's tools, but a butcher's knife. And in the silence of the cabins, Lydia held her sons and prayed against what she could already sense, that Greaves would not rest until he had tested how far one life could be torn from another. By the turn of 1850 into 1851, the Harroway Twins began to vanish from the daily rhythms of the plantation. For years, Isaiah's laughter had been heard in the fields, and Jacob's frail figure had been glimpsed in the shadows of the cabins. But now their presence grew scarce, as though the earth itself had swallowed them. Days passed without sight of either boy, and when they did emerge, it was often at night, led by Greaves through the back of the house, their faces pale, their steps unsteady. Neighbours noticed their absence as well. Farmers who had once whispered about the strange boys began to ask questions. Some said Jacob had already died, his fragile body unable to withstand the doctor's examinations. Others swore they had seen Isaiah wandering the yard alone, his shoulders stooped, his eyes hollow, as if half his life had been torn away. A woman from a neighbouring farm recalled hearing him cry out one night, a cry that seemed less like a child's sorrow and more like the keening of something broken beyond repair. Inside the cabins, the enslaved spoke little of the boys, but their silence carried more weight than words. Lydia, once seen carrying her children to the river, now kept to herself, her face lined with exhaustion. Some claimed she had tried to hide them away, refusing to surrender them to Greaves's visits. But resistance was futile in the world of the Harroway estate. Harroway's word was law, and Greaves's curiosity was insatiable. The overseer, McClellan, confessed unease. He reported to Harroway that when he passed by the doctor's quarters one evening, he heard the sound of weeping, followed by a silence so sudden it chilled him. "I do not think both are still alive," he muttered, though he could not say which. Harroway brushed him off with a sneer, claiming such matters were for physicians, not field hands. Yet even he began to keep the boys out of sight when visitors came, instructing Greaves to conduct his examinations behind locked doors. And then, one summer's morning, the names Isaiah and Jacob appeared briefly in the parish burial register. They were written in a hurried hand, only to be crossed out with heavy strokes of ink. The clerk left no explanation, no date of death, no cause, only two names stricken through as though to erase them entirely. It was the first official sign that the Harroway twins had been laid to rest. But the manner of their passing, and whether both had truly gone to the grave, remained a question the parish dared not answer aloud. The parish register that mentions the Harroway twins is one of the most disturbing artifacts tied to their story. It survives today only in fragments, a single yellowed page preserved in the archives of a rural church, its ink faded and its edges gnawed by time. Near the bottom of the entry for that summer lies the faint outline of two names, Isaiah Harroway and Jacob Harroway. At first glance, they seem ordinary enough, but the closer one looks, the more unsettling they become. The ink is smeared, the lettering marred by deep scratches, as though someone had not merely crossed them out, but tried to tear them from the page altogether. Why strike through the names of two children already consigned to the grave? The clerk who recorded the entry left no note, no explanation. But in the margins, faint and nearly illegible, someone scrawled two words. Not dead. Whether those words were written by the clerk himself or added later by a nervous hand, no one can say. Yet the suggestion alone is chilling, that one of the twins had been laid in the earth still breathing. Local accounts, preserved in half-remembered testimony, speak of a hurried burial. A storm was rising that day, and the ground had already begun to swell with rain. The boys were lowered together into a shallow grave behind the church, their coffins stacked one upon the other as though haste had outweighed dignity. Some who stood nearby claimed to hear faint tapping from within the smaller of the boxes, a sound quickly silenced by the thudding of dirt against the lid. Others swore they heard Isaiah crying out until the very last spadeful of earth was pressed down. The parish register, torn and defaced, became a kind of silent witness to this rumour. The scratches across their names seem less like clerical correction and more like an attempt to erase a truth too dreadful to leave visible. If one twin had been buried alive, then the parish itself bore responsibility for a horror that no sermon could sanctify. To this day, the page remains an unsettling relic, Scholars debate whether the not dead scrawl is authentic or the invention of later hands. But among the freedmen who carried the memory of the Harroways long after the Civil War, the story of the burial was repeated with certainty. They did not argue whether a child had been laid in the ground alive. They argued only which one. When emancipation came and the bonds of slavery were broken, many of those who had once lived under Harroway's hand carried with them not only scars, but stories. Among these were whispers of the twins, stories passed carefully, often in the low murmur of night fires or in the pauses between hymns. Freedmen who had worked the fields remembered the strange children, and their recollections were laced with unease. One man, interviewed decades later by a local journalist, recalled being a boy of 10 when the burial took place. He spoke of standing at the edge of the churchyard, watching as rain darkened the soil and the gravedigger shoveled dirt over the coffins. "I heard it," he insisted, his voice trembling even as an old man. A cry, faint but sharp, like a child calling from beneath the ground. They said it was the storm, the wind in the trees. But I know a cry when I hear one. That boy wasn't gone yet. Another, a woman who had been among the cabin mothers, whispered of Lydia's grief. She said the mother had tried to dig at the earth with her bare hands after the burial, weeping that one son's spirit had not yet departed. The overseers dragged her away, and her cries were silenced under threats of the lash. Yet for years afterward, she avoided the churchyard, claiming she could still hear muffled knocks rising from the soil on stormy nights. These testimonies, though fragmented and coloured by time, share a dreadful consistency. The belief that one Harroway twin had been consigned to the grave alive. Some said it was Jacob, too weak to protest, but too stubborn to release his hold on life. Others swore it was Isaiah, the stronger brother forced down into silence so that Jacob's suffering might finally end. The ambiguity only deepened the horror. In every telling, however, the burial was remembered not as an accident, but as a choice. Those who lived through it believed the parish, the doctor, and Harroway himself knew what they were doing. That the bond between the boys was so unnatural, so unsettling, that it was easier to suffocate it beneath earth than to allow it to linger. And so the freedmen carried this story with them, not as legend, but as warning. They spoke of it in whispers to their children, not to frighten them with ghosts, but to remind them of the cruelty of a world that would rather bury the strange alive than allow it to exist. Years after the Harroway twins were said to have been laid in the earth, fragments of Dr. Silas Greaves' writings surfaced in the most unlikely of places. Hidden among the papers of a medical society in Savannah were pages torn from a journal, their edges singed as though they had once been tossed into fire. The ink was faint, but the words that remained were damning. Greaves wrote not with the curiosity of a healer, but with the detachment of a man who had long since abandoned compassion. One passage describes the night of final inquiry, in which he claimed to have pressed Jacob's failing body beyond endurance, while Isaiah, healthy and unmarked, convulsed in the next room. "The reflection is absolute," he scrawled, "a tether of vitality most unnatural. It cannot be explained by mere coincidence, nor dismissed as hysteria. These children are not two, but one, cruelly divided." He ended the entry with words more chilling still. "If death be the cost of truth, then so be it." Another page, smudged with water stains, refers cryptically to the silence at last. The phrase has been interpreted in many ways. Some believe it was Greaves's admission that one twin had been killed in order to sever the bond. Others read it as his resignation that the boys had been buried and the mystery taken with them. But the handwriting trails off suddenly, the ink dragged across the page as though the pen had been snatched away mid-thought. Perhaps most unsettling is a note written in the margin, in a smaller, almost frantic hand. "It will not leave me," it reads. "Even now I feel it. The echo." Some scholars argue that Greaves himself began to sense the very bond he sought to prove, that his obsession had crept into his own mind until he could no longer separate observation from affliction. Others suggest it was the scrawl of a guilty conscience, the whisper of a man haunted by what he had done. No further records of Greaves' work with the Harroway Twins exist. His later publications make no mention of them, as though their case had been deliberately excised from his career. It is as if he had touched something too dreadful to admit publicly, yet too extraordinary to fully destroy. And so what remains are only fragments, broken sentences, haunted margins, and the uneasy impression that even in his final notes, Greaves had not escaped the echo of two voices that refused to be silenced. Long after the names Isaiah and Jacob Harroway were struck from the parish register, their story refused to vanish. It did not survive in medical journals or plantation ledgers, but in whispers, in the kind of folklore that takes root in soil watered by fear. In the rural South, where memory and superstition often intertwined, the twins became figures of ghost tale and caution. Parents warned their children not to linger near the river after dark, lest they hear the cries of the brother who breathed beneath the earth. Travellers spoke of a pale-eyed boy glimpsed on the banks, staring silently from the reeds before vanishing into the mist. One enduring tale claimed that during heavy rains, knocks could be heard rising from the churchyard ground, muffled and rhythmic, as though one coffin still held restless hands. Others insisted the sound was not knocking but weeping, carried up through the soil when thunder rolled. The children of the county grew up daring one another to walk past the ruined church at night, their courage often broken by the faint echo of what they swore was a voice calling their name. Among the black community, the twins were remembered differently. Elders spoke of them as twin spirits, one strong, one frail, forced apart by cruelty, but bound together even in death. Some said they appeared as omens, Isaiah to warn of hardship, Jacob to signal loss. Songs were whispered around firelight, not of mourning, but of recognition, keeping their memory alive in the only way left to those who had seen them. For the enslaved, and later the freed, the Harroway twins became symbols of both suffering and survival, proof that even when erased from paper, their story could not be erased from memory. For the white families who carried the tale, the tone was different. The twins were told of as a haunting, a curse upon the land, their cries a reminder that the soil itself was unsettled. It was easier to turn them into phantoms than to admit the cruelty that had buried them alive. Thus, the legend of the Harroway twins grew, stitched together from fragments of fact and embroidery of fear. Their names became less important than the echo they left behind, a reminder that the past does not stay buried, and that the dead, whether truly gone or not, have ways of making themselves remembered. When the Civil War finally ended and the chains of slavery were broken, the South was left in ruins. Plantations that had once thrived on human misery collapsed into weeds and rot, their ledgers burned, their churches abandoned. In that upheaval, many stories were lost, and many were deliberately silenced. The Harroway twins were among them. Their names, already scratched from the parish register, faded further as the decades wore on, leaving little more than fragments of testimony and whispers of folklore. The freedmen who remembered them carried their story carefully, but they carried scars as well. Survival often meant silence, and in a new world still hostile to their voices, some chose not to speak of the twins at all. They feared mockery from outsiders, or worse, reprisal from those who did not wish the past unearthed. What had once been spoken in whispers around fires became spoken only in prayers, until even prayers grew quiet. Meanwhile, among the white families of the county, silence took another form. The Harroway name lingered in land records and legal disputes, but any mention of the twins was conspicuously absent. Newspapers that recounted local history glossed over their existence, treating their story as superstition unworthy of record. It was easier to forget, easier to dismiss than to reckon with the truth. That two children had been consigned to the grave not because they were dead, but because they were feared. Dr. Greaves himself vanished from public record after the 1850s. His name does not appear in the rosters of established medical societies beyond that decade, nor in obituaries. Some say he fled north, his reputation tarnished by whispers of experiments too grim to publish. Others claim he remained in Georgia, practicing quietly until his death, his journals hidden or destroyed by those who inherited them. Whatever the truth, his silence became part of the larger erasure. By the time the century turned, the twins existed only as rumor, their story dissolving into the mist of ghost tales told to frighten children. Yet silence does not erase, it only delays. Beneath that quiet, fragments remained, a torn register, a scorched journal page, and the memories of those who could not forget the sound of weeping beneath the earth. The world may have chosen not to speak of the Harroway twins, but the earth itself seemed unwilling to let them rest. In the years that followed the war, researchers and clerks who attempted to trace the Harroway twins found themselves confronted with absence. Records that should have existed were missing, while others bore curious signs of tampering. The parish register, with its scratched-out names, was the most glaring example, but it was not the only one. Plantation ledgers that once listed births and deaths of the enslaved showed blank spaces where Isaiah and Jacob ought to have appeared. Pages had been torn from family Bibles, lines smudged beyond recognition as though someone had moved through the county with the deliberate purpose of erasing them from history. Even in the world of medicine, where Greaves had once boasted of his discovery, silence fell like a curtain. Medical journals of the period occasionally carried veiled references to a case in Georgia involving duplicated vitality, but never by name. In some surviving issues, footnotes appear suddenly truncated, ending mid-sentence, or else scratched out in ink so heavy it bleeds through the page. It is as if an unseen editor had decided that the twins were not to be remembered, that their existence should be confined to the margins of memory. One scholar, writing in the early 20th century, lamented this vanishing act. "It is as though," he wrote, "the archives themselves conspire against remembrance. The case is not merely rare, it is forbidden. Where we expect evidence, we find only holes." His frustration was echoed by later researchers who suspected that Greaves' colleagues, men of influence in the medical societies of Charleston and Savannah, had deliberately suppressed his work. To admit that such a case had existed would be to acknowledge both the cruelty of their science and the horror of what had been done in its name. And yet, fragments refused to stay buried. A letter here, a rumor there, the occasional newspaper clipping written in a tone half curious, half fearful. Each piece pointed back to the same vanished truth. Two children who should have been ordinary, but were instead made into a spectacle, an experiment, and finally an erasure. The very absence of records became its own kind of testimony, a silence louder than words. By the dawn of the new century, the Harroway twins had become less a matter of fact and more a matter of folklore, but within that silence, traces still lingered, waiting for the patient eye, the careful hand, or perhaps the haunted imagination to stitch them back together. It was not until the early 1900s that new fragments of the Harroway mystery surfaced, and they did so not in the halls of medicine, but in the attic of a crumbling house outside Savannah. The widow of a physician, a man who had once corresponded with Dr. Silas Greaves, left behind a small bundle of letters tied with fraying twine. They were discovered by her grandchildren as they sorted through her effects, and though most were burned as worthless scraps, a few survived long enough to be transcribed. Those letters, faded and trembling in ink, spoke of a burden her husband could not shake. "My husband," she wrote, "was haunted by the children he called the Black Twins of Georgia. He would wake in the night and whisper of their cries, of their eyes that seemed to follow him even after he had turned away. He told me once that Dr. Greaves believed them to share one life between two, and that he had sought to prove it with the knife. I begged him not to tell me more, for the look in his face was enough. It was as though he had seen a thing that could not be unseen." In another letter, she confessed her fear of the journals he had brought home, journals she claimed reeked of smoke and damp, filled with diagrams of small bodies and notes written in a fevered hand. "I burned most of them," she admitted, "for I feared what they might summon if left in this house. But I could not bring myself to destroy them all. Some remain, though I dare not look again." These letters, though second-hand and softened by memory, offer a chilling confirmation that the twins were spoken of among physicians long after their burial. They were not dismissed as folklore, but as a case so unsettling that even those who heard of it could not rest easy. The widow's words capture not the precision of science, but the dread of conscience, the way a story festers when it has been forced into silence. What became of the remaining journals she hinted at is unknown. Some claim they were passed into private collections, hidden away by families who feared scandal. Others believe they were destroyed, their ashes mingling with the dust of forgotten archives. But the mere fact that her letters survived is enough to remind us that the Harroway twins were not inventions of rumour alone. Their presence was real enough to haunt, and their memory powerful enough to scorch itself into the hearts of those who could not bear to keep their papers intact. When the official records grew silent, folklore stepped in to preserve what memory would not allow to vanish. Among the freedmen, the Harroway twins were woven into older traditions, their story reshaped through the lens of African spiritual belief. In Yoruba cosmology, carried across the Atlantic in fragments, twins were considered sacred, embodiments of a dual spirit, one often protective, the other vulnerable. Elders whispered that Isaiah and Jacob were such beings, born into bondage but carrying a force greater than any master's will. Some said Isaiah represented the body, strong and enduring, while Jacob bore the soul, frail but eternal. To harm one, they warned, was to wound the other. At the same time, European superstitions brought by settlers lent their own shadows to the tale. Among the Scotch-Irish families who settled the region, twins were often seen as ill omens, signs of disorder in nature. A child who mirrored another too closely was said to be marked, sometimes even mistaken for a changeling. When these ideas collided with African traditions in the crucible of slavery, they produced a hybrid folklore, stories that carried both reverence and dread. By the late 19th century, Isaiah and Jacob lived on less as boys and more as archetypes. Around firelight, children were warned that to disrespect a twin was to invite misfortune. Young couples were told not to separate siblings by force, lest the surviving child waste away in sorrow. And in the white communities, the twins became a tale of haunting, the restless spirits of the churchyard who rattled their coffins in storms, reminders of sins best left unspoken. This blending of traditions ensured the Harroways were never truly forgotten, even as paper records rotted away. Their story existed in the liminal space between fact and myth, truth and superstition. Each retelling was a kind of resistance, a way of preserving what the powerful had tried to erase. For the oppressed, the twins embodied survival of memory. For the oppressors, they embodied a curse that could not be buried. It is this crossroads of folklore, African sacred twinship, European fear of duplicity, and American guilt, that gave the Harroway legend its endurance. Stripped of names, stripped of dates, the boys nonetheless lived on in story, their bond carried forward in the only medium that could not be torn from a ledger or struck from a register, the human voice, whispering in the dark. Decades passed, and the Harroway plantation slipped further into ruin. The churchyard where the twins were said to rest became little more than broken stones choked by weeds, a place children avoided and elders passed in silence. But nature has a way of unearthing what men try to conceal. By the early 20th century, heavy rains had eroded the edge of the graveyard, washing away layers of soil and exposing the outlines of two small coffins beneath the roots of a toppled tree. Local boys who stumbled upon them described the sight in frightened tones: wood blackened by rot, iron nails streaked with rust, lids pressed together as if the earth itself had forced them into one grave. Word spread quickly, and before long, curious eyes from the town came to see. Some swore they saw the bones of children within, still curled as though in restless sleep. Others claimed to hear faint tapping when the wind rattled the wood, as though some echo of that long-ago burial still lingered in the soil. One account, recorded in a county paper of the 1920s, spoke of scratch marks along the inside of one coffin lid. The journalist, skeptical by nature, dismissed them as the gnawing of rats or the splitting of damp wood. Yet witnesses insisted the marks were too deliberate, too human, long grooves as if carved by desperate fingers clawing for escape. For those who already believed one Harroway twin had been buried alive, it was confirmation they needed no further proof of. The parish attempted to rebury the coffins quietly, covering them with fresh earth and planting a young oak atop the site. But the damage had been done. Once more, the twins were spoken of openly, their story rising like breath from the ground. Visitors travelled miles to peer at the disturbed earth, to whisper about the brothers said to share one soul. Preachers thundered against the tales, calling them heathen superstition, while elders in the black community shook their heads, certain that the land itself would never let the boys rest. Whether the scratch marks were real or imagined, whether the bones were truly theirs or another family's, mattered little in the end. What mattered was the impression left behind, a physical reminder of a story too grim to dismiss, a grave that refused to stay sealed. The Harroway twins had returned once more, not in flesh, but in the silent testimony of earth and wood. By the time the coffins were uncovered, the story of the Harroway twins had accumulated layers of rumour, testimony and fear. Yet when one begins to piece those fragments together, a pattern emerges, a dreadful symmetry that mirrors the very bond the boys were said to share. The signs had been present from the beginning: Isaiah and Jacob's mirrored pain, the overseer's muttered warnings, the doctor's fevered notes. Each detail that once seemed isolated becomes, in hindsight, part of a larger design. The parish register, with its scratched-out names and the chilling note of "not dead," can no longer be dismissed as clerical error. The freedmen's recollections of muffled cries beneath the earth align too closely with the scratch marks discovered decades later inside the coffin lid. Greaves's journal fragments, with their talk of silence at last, echo the testimonies of neighbours who swore that the twins vanished in secrecy, their lives taken not by nature but by design. It is as though every piece of evidence, scattered and incomplete, circles back to the same conclusion, that one of the Harroway twins was buried alive to end the torment of the other. Whether that act was seen as mercy, cruelty, or experiment depends on who tells the story. To the parish, it may have been an attempt to erase a blasphemous anomaly. To Harroway, it was simply the conclusion of a bargain, the closing of a ledger. To Greaves, it was the grim fulfillment of an obsession that demanded proof at any cost. And to the enslaved community, it was one more act of brutality in a world where black lives were treated as expendable curiosities. What makes the story endure is not merely the horror of a child buried alive, but the way the tragedy was hidden, denied, and transformed into silence. The very absence of official record is its own testimony, the deliberate erasure a signal that something too disturbing had occurred to be admitted in daylight. In that silence, the twins' bond takes on an even darker resonance. If Isaiah and Jacob truly shared one life between them, then perhaps the burial was not just of a child, but of a mystery, an attempt to suffocate a truth that unsettled both science and superstition alike. And yet, for all the efforts to bury them, the Harroway twins continue to surface, in folklore, in testimony, in soil that will not stay sealed. Their story refuses closure, echoing across generations like the cries that some swear were once heard rising from the earth. The tragedy of the Harroway twins does not exist in isolation. Their story, whether pieced together from testimony or wrapped in folklore, fits into a larger and undeniable history, one in which black bodies were treated as resources for profit, curiosity, and experiment. In the antebellum South, enslaved men, women, and children were subjected to medical procedures without consent, their suffering excused in the name of progress. The Harroway case, with its whispered accounts of needles, cuts, and mirrored agony, was not an aberration, but a reflection of a cruel pattern. Consider the record of physicians like J. Marion Sims, who performed experimental surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia, claiming their supposed resilience made them suitable subjects. Or the countless unnamed individuals dissected in secret by medical students, their bodies stolen from graves under cover of night. Each case shares the same cold truth, that the lives of the enslaved were not regarded as lives at all, but as instruments for knowledge that would serve others. The Harroway twins were merely two among many whose humanity was obscured beneath the language of science. What makes their story uniquely haunting is the way their bond confounded both superstition and medicine. Greaves sought to prove a theory, the parish sought to smother a scandal, and Harroway sought to profit from their existence. Yet in each attempt, the twins themselves were erased, not regarded as children, not even as individuals, but as a case, a phenomenon, an inconvenience to be buried. This was the legacy of exploitation. Not only physical violation, but the deliberate stripping away of voice and identity. The echoes of such cruelty did not end with emancipation. Generations later, black communities would again suffer at the hands of medical institutions, from the Tuskegee syphilis study to forced sterilizations carried out in silence. These were not isolated events, but continuations of a mindset rooted in the same soil that buried the Harroway twins, the belief that certain lives could be used, hidden, and discarded without consequence. To reflect on the Harroway twins, then, is to see more than a ghost story. It is to confront the pattern of erasure that shadows American history, the way some bodies were treated as specimens and others as sources of fear. Their tale, whether whispered as folklore or hinted at in scorched journals, is a reminder that what was done in the name of science was often nothing more than cruelty cloaked in the language of discovery. Modern science, with all its instruments and studies, has long attempted to explain the mysteries of twins. Researchers speak of shared genetics, mirrored development, and the uncanny phenomenon known as twin telepathy, the sense that one sibling can feel what happens to the other, even across great distances. Cases are recorded of twins who wake in the same hour from identical dreams, who fall ill on the same day, though separated by hundreds of miles, or who sense accidents the moment they occur. Scientists argue over whether these are coincidences, products of shared environment, or subtle neurological bonds we cannot yet measure. But whatever the explanation, the fascination remains. When viewed through this lens, the legend of the Harroway twins feels less like folklore and more like a chilling early example of the same phenomenon. Accounts of Isaiah collapsing when Jacob was cut, of Jacob weeping when Isaiah was whipped, echo eerily with modern reports of sympathetic pain. Yet unlike the stories of twins reunited in laboratories or celebrated in books, the Harroway bond was never studied with respect, only with cruelty. Where today's researchers seek understanding, Greaves sought dominance. Where families marvel at the uncanny ties between siblings, Harroway and his parish sought to bury those ties in the earth. Some modern scholars who revisit the tale suggest that the twins' suffering may point to more than coincidence. They note that psychosomatic responses, where the mind can manifest the body's pain, are real, but rarely so consistent as those described. The precision of the Harroway's mirrored afflictions defies easy explanation, suggesting that something more profound was at work, whether biological, spiritual, or both. Others dismiss the legend as myth, insisting that the scratch marks in the coffin, the muffled cries, and the mirrored injuries were embellishments born of fear. But even in dismissal, the story remains, a thorn that refuses to dissolve under scrutiny. The tragedy, of course, is that we will never know. Modern science might have offered answers, might have treated the Harroways with dignity and curiosity rather than cruelty. Instead, their bond was smothered under greed, superstition, and silence. What remains are echoes, faint parallels between their suffering and the mysteries that continue to confound researchers today. If Isaiah and Jacob were alive now, their bond might have been studied in laboratories, written of in journals, even marveled at as a wonder of human connection. Instead, their story lies buried, not in textbooks, but in soil and shadow. When we look back on the story of the Harroway twins, we are not only peering into a forgotten corner of history, we are staring into a mirror held up to human cruelty. What lingers most is not the mystery of their bond, nor even the horror of their burial, but the silence that followed. Their names were scratched from records, their lives reduced to fragments of rumor and half-burned notes. This deliberate erasure is its own kind of violence, as brutal as any incision or lash, for to erase a life from history is to kill it twice, once in the body and again in memory. The twins remind us that history is not simply what has been written down, but also what has been deliberately concealed. Those who held power decided what was recorded and what was forgotten, who was counted and who was discarded. For Isaiah and Jacob, being black children born into slavery meant their lives were always at the mercy of others, masters, ministers, and doctors who saw them not as sons, but as tools, omens, or curiosities. In such a world, their humanity was never allowed to speak for itself, and yet the very survival of their story proves that silence cannot fully prevail. Folklore kept them alive when ledgers did not. Testimonies whispered around firelight carried their cries further than any parish register could. Even the earth, it seems, conspired to reveal them again, tearing open the grave that men had tried to seal. No matter how many times their memory was erased, it surfaced once more, as if demanding to be heard. What the Harroway twins leave us with is a question as haunting as their legend. How many others were buried in silence, their stories lost because they were not convenient to remember? For every fragment that reaches us, how many more have been consigned to the dark? The tragedy of Isaiah and Jacob is not only their suffering, but the reminder that cruelty thrives where memory is denied. To tell their story now, whether as history or legend, is to resist that denial. It is to grant them the dignity their world refused, to acknowledge them not as experiments or omens, but as children whose bond defied comprehension. And in doing so, we are forced to confront the truth that the past is not only what happened, it is what was hidden and what still waits to be uncovered. If you travel to that corner of Georgia today, the Harroway plantation no longer stands. The great house has collapsed into ruins, the fields have been swallowed by vines, and the parish church is little more than stone foundations hidden beneath moss. Yet the graveyard remains, its earth uneven, its markers weathered beyond reading. Locals say that on certain nights, when the air is heavy and the cicadas fall quiet, you can hear the wind rushing through the trees like children's laughter, sharp and fleeting, carried on the air as though from another time. The supposed grave of Isaiah and Jacob lies beneath the shadow of an oak, its roots twisting deep into the ground where two small coffins were once uncovered. There are no names carved in stone, no dates etched into marble, only the faint suggestion of disturbed soil and the uneasy silence of those who pass it. Travelers who stumble across the spot often speak of a sudden chill, a sense of being watched, of eyes pale and unblinking fixed upon them from just beyond the shadows. Whether this is imagination or something more, none can say with certainty. But what lingers is the impression of absence, a life stolen not only by cruelty but by time, a story denied its place in the light. The Harroway twins were meant to be forgotten, consigned to earth and silence, yet they return again and again, in rumour, in fragments, in the restless unease of the land itself. Perhaps it is fitting. Perhaps children who were denied their names in life should claim eternity in whispers, ensuring that the parish which tried to bury them has instead become forever marked by their presence. As the night deepens and the shadows lengthen across the graveyard, one cannot help but wonder if the twins are still there, bound together as they always were. Maybe the soil holds not only bones, but echoes, cries pressed into the earth, laughter etched into the air, waiting for anyone brave enough to listen. And perhaps that is the true haunting of the Harroways, not that they suffered, but that their story refuses to stay silent. Even now, in the stillness of that ruined churchyard, it is as though the past leans close to whisper. And if you pause long enough, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the faint rhythm of two hearts beating as one beneath the ground. And so, we are left with the Harroway twins, two boys born into bondage, bound by a mystery that neither science nor superstition could explain, and buried beneath soil that could never keep them hidden. Were Isaiah and Jacob victims of medical cruelty, sacrificed on the altar of a doctor's obsession? Were they condemned by a parish that feared their bond as an affront to God? Or was their tragedy something stranger still, a force older than faith or reason, a single soul divided and punished for daring to exist twice in the world. The fragments that remain do not give us certainty. They offer only glimpses: the torn parish register, the scorched journal pages, the testimonies of freedmen who swore they heard cries beneath the earth. Each piece demands we confront the possibility that one of the brothers was buried alive to silence the other, that their final moment was not one of rest but of desperate struggle beneath the weight of soil. It is a thought too grim to linger on, yet impossible to set aside. Perhaps that is why their story endures. Not because we know the truth, but because we cannot. The Harroway Twins exist now in the liminal space between history and legend, fact and folklore. Their names, once scratched from the record, now live again in whispers, in stories, and in the unease of anyone who dares to speak them aloud. And so I leave you with the question that cannot be answered. Were the Harroway Twins merely victims of a cruel age, or did they carry within them a mystery that the world was too fearful to face? What do you believe? If you're drawn to stories like this, fragments of history, unsettling mysteries, and the shadows that cling to the past, subscribe to the Macabre Record. And in the comments below, tell me where you're listening from. I want to know how far the echoes of forgotten voices can reach. Because some stories do not rest, no matter how deeply they are buried. And the tale of the Harroway Twins, whether truth or legend, is one that refuses to be silenced.